On Siecle. Alright, well, that had to be one of my greatest gaming disappointments that I can remember. Is it that terrible a game? No, it's not. But I had built up such high expectations for it. This is something I wanted for 20 years. And La Foile Le Glaive also ended up quite a disappointment. There have been great surprises in gaming too for me, but this is one that I expected to be so much. Reading some of the reviews, hey, some people talked about it as a lighter EU. I don't think that's fair. It tries to do something different. In fact, people are going to say, well, it ain't trying to do that. But I would say it tries to do what I wish, and I've mentioned this before, I'm looking for it. It's a Wallace game, Struggle of Empires. What I wish Struggle of Empires did. Grounding that era, a century and such not, of real balance of power conflict, where the sort of core of modern Europe is being nailed out. Post-Reformation, 30 Years of War, seeing the real rise of nation states during this period. Now, EU covers that era, there's no question. But EU covers it in a level of detail and control that at times seems ludicrous, actually. Like, in terms of being able to control where your colonization attempts are, where precisely your explorers are heading, and all this sort of stuff. This feels like it actually leans more towards Struggle of Empires than what EU tries to do. EU gives you this godlike command over the game. So what are my big problems with this? The first one is the rules. The rules, the organization of them, not the translation, which appears to be very, very fidelious. It actually appears very good. The lack of a translation of the player aids and of some of the charts, some of the information in the actual scenarios, the minor scenarios, which may actually be pretty good on their own. All of that makes it rougher. But the rules also fail beyond just an organizational difficulty, lack of cross-references in many cases. This is stuff that multiple plays would fix, right? I would eventually hammer out and understand. Or if not, I would come to my own understanding of what the game meant to me, which is, I think, what I've done with EU. I think that I've gone so far from the rules in some cases that I'm playing something different, but something that largely works for me. And that's kind of what I was looking at here. Unfortunately, this doesn't really give you, maybe because it's less intuitive, it doesn't give you that real grasp of what it is you're running and doing, or what the rules meant to represent in some cases. So the mercantile operations, very abstracted. They seem to be very much directed at certain things, but then they kind of fail to absolutely make the kind of sense you'd expect. Likewise, the loan rules. Again, stepping away from giving you absolute control of your country's economy. You no longer can say, I have a loan due, in 3 years, and if I put aside the money, the inflation rate probably will get me so that I can pay that off specifically. Okay. But that kind of makes sense. The loan rules in this don't allow you to save up money and use that for anything. And there's a good argument for why that's the case. Look at the United States. Very, very wealthy country. Tons and tons of cash that we could very quickly pay off the national debt, but for political and, frankly, systemic reasons that you would disrupt our economy and probably destroy it, you can't just take piles and piles of money you have and shift them to another usage. You can't just say, yeah, you know what, screw Social Security, man. Let's just, the hell with that, you know? And I mean, it's not just a democracy that has this problem. Even autocracies have to please their citizens to the extent that their citizens don't hang them. If you've given people a bargain, a social compact, and then you try to just default on that, it's a tough situation. You see that with what happened in Greece, where it wasn't, you know, an absolute restructuring either. So the kind of control that you have in EU is probably unreasonable. But it is frustrating to not be able to hold back some degree of control over your economy. You feel like you're playing a game and you should have that. Multiple different ways to handle passing of financial subsidies to other countries, though. See, now that goes against it, because whatever that money is that you could be paying your loans off with, you're perfectly free to just hand it to your neighbor, that whole big pile. And likewise, you're perfectly free to use it in wartime and to raise armies. You're perfectly free to do so many different things with it that it feels like the game didn't really nail down what may have been some very clever ideas. Instead, it leaves it in kind of this muddled land that leaves me feeling muddled about the game. Let me think a little bit. Military. Feels really, yeah, it's very abstracted. So it's very hard to like look at it and say, damn, that's just wrong. But within that abstraction, things aren't terribly clearly explained, at least to my poor mind. To say, for example, the winter quarters rule, it doesn't really make sense what the ordering of that is. And I ended up, I think, more or less eventually just disregarding it, because it stops being really a reasonable thing. And when you consider that the Swedish army, well, you could say they were in winter quarters, especially when they were in Turkey. What little there was of them. So, you know, certainly there was a winter quartering, but the degree to which, you know, that has to be respected in a 2-turn per year game where, okay, depending on how I read it, it could mean I can't even attack on that second turn of the year. And I usually can't manage to attack on the first turn of the year because I'm like, you know, trying to pull my troops together and gather them from mustering zones. The effectiveness of the supply depots, where attrition is your major cost in the game in a lot of cases, because quite often you can't bring the opponent to battle. A lot of little problems like that. But then add to that component lacks. First of all, the actual counters are, in some cases, colored poorly. There's some misprints. Those aren't too major. You can rewrite them. The script on the counters is unreadable, and not just because it's in French. The event counters are fine. But the leader counters, sometimes it's difficult to read what the year, well, no, not sometimes. It is impossible for me to read the years off of them. But yeah, when you've got countries sharing the same color, or set of colors, and it's all mixed up, there's no clear place to look in the rules to find out, hey, what these setup counters, etc., whose are they, what are they? It really took me playing several turns through the game to begin to realize, oh, that's part of that country, and I think that means that it's not really home country units of that. And gosh, I don't really know. The map. Unreadable province names. Yeah, some of them are readable, but these guys over in Russia, the green on green, I can't see this worth crap. And the script, you know, I mean, it's really easy when I know the names of the provinces. When it's something like Brandenburg, yeah, I can pretty much get it. But there's a lot of provinces here that are in territories that I'm not familiar with, and then it's going to probably go with most players of the game. There's going to be some provincial territories that you don't know the names of them. The headache of trying to place your troops in the right mustering zones, where I just gave up on it and started saying, okay, I'm going to pick my troops at random and they'll show up where they show up. You know, I mean, you're taking away some of the nice levers in the game. There's this nice attribute in the game of, if I take a territory from you, you can't build troops in that territory anymore. Well, that's still the truth, but if my troops are starting to sprout up randomly throughout my country because I can't handle the design decision and how it's implemented, that's a problem. Lack of player aids. Everything's got to be kept track of on paper. Well, here this was the treasuries that I made, but most of the rest of it is paper, but it's not quite the level of paper that EU has. So EU requires that you're filling out this spreadsheet. It requires, essentially, you have so much information on each country that, quite honestly, making, you know, that any player aids would have eaten up space. Something like Empires in Arms with little charts for each of the troop forces that are on the board. Well, in this, you need a lot less, but it's difficult to figure out how to best provide for that information. So, for example, who owns what territory? Well, there's a player aid that's missing. They didn't add little control markers to the territory mix. I had to rip them out of EU, and they didn't quite fit because, well, Russia's a different color and Turkey's a different color. They kind of switch. Little issues like that. The fact that this is a 5-player game, and that the 5-player game is some weird sort of thing where you're playing 2 powers, that's a pity. I found that the 10-player game was playable, but it looked like some powers probably had little or no chance of winning. The minor powers, for the most part. Your Sweden, your Poland, they have too many things against them. It would have been nice to see the game balanced for 10. Especially since the rules kind of say, yeah, you can do this in more than 5, and you know, some people have pairs, some people don't, and that's too bad. I don't see that working too well, but let me look at the victory conditions, because I'm a little curious about how the 10-player or the 5-player game is supposed to be won, not how my. Yeah, you add your powers. So that means, gosh, what does that mean? I don't know what that means if you're playing 6 players in a 5-player scenario. You know, 10 players, hey, some powers don't have as good a chance of winning, and such is, you know. But I was hoping for a more game-oriented coverage, where this ended up than EU provides. One where, you know, there's actually the possibility of people feeling like they should be balanced. And I thought it would be. I really did. I thought that the balance of power in the game, the lack of specific events, etc., would help generate a more even game. But what it ended up instead doing was certain things, in particular the mercantile ability, gave too much in a constant victory point flow. Is that the only determining factor? Nah, hell no. If you could turn a game around with a Sweden, certainly with a Prussia or an Austria, if you could, Sweden, Poland, if you could turn the game around on its head and really get your allies to work well with you because you don't have a chance of winning, and gain territories, hold on to important territories, you can walk away with a victory with the end of campaign things. Okay. Okay, so if you end up with only one power in a game where some people have two powers, you get to double your victory points. Again, that's obviously not going to really make up for things. So the thing that you're given in player aids is, of course, these little photocopy sheets. This is AWE standard. And unfortunately, they are in French. And they're also a jumble of information. There's just so much. So you have national information. Much of it is information that is somewhat useful, especially since it'll lead in... Oh, you can get double pensions. I forgot about that. Nobody could afford it, but especially since some of this leads into the rules. In particular, let me see. Like, well, what are these claims? What's about them? How do I know about claims? And how do I know about hereditary regions and stuff like that? Well, these things are scattered throughout the rules, so some cross-referencing there might have been useful. I don't know how much. But you've got a lot of the information that I felt was necessary to keep track of on here. But obviously you don't want to keep track of it on here. Photocopies would work, because if you start erasing it the amount of times you do, you're going to wear holes in this after one game. On the other side of this, you have a number of reminders, again, all in French, so it's a little difficult, but trying to see if there's anything here. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of stuff here that would be very helpful if you could get familiar with it, and certainly that's going to be easier if you're reading French. The unfortunate fact that it doesn't reference into the rules, well, that means that poor me, I don't have little references that tell me what I'm dealing with here. It's also not enough to handle everything. The peace, games like this, EU, Empires in Arms, a lot of them revolve around the kind of peace conditions that you can come to and when you can and can't come to peace. The peace conditions in this are a little weird. They're based only on territorial concerns. In the sense that if someone calls for a victorious peace or surrenders, it's the amount of territory that they've taken that determines how much they get from you, both in territory and in other demands. Again, some ambiguities there. Hey, what the hell's the difference between a major and a minor, or a regular and a bonus demand? I made up my own rules there, as I did for a lot of things in this game. One of the biggest hindrances for me in playing were these little pulled event chits. Again, all in French. These could be rewritten perhaps as cards. The problem with that, of course, is they'd have to be shuffled all the time. There are regular reshuffles of the deck. There's a remix counter in here. So there's a number of things against these for me, and that really kind of hindered my ability. First of all, anything where I have a handful of events, whether they're chits or otherwise, that I can kind of contemplate and play whenever I like, I'm going to forget to do so. Worse in solitaire, but even in an opposed game, I'm often sitting there saying, oh shit, I could have done this again. That's just the nature of me playing a game. It's going to be something that I dislike about it. When we go to the little chits, there's almost no information on them. They're in French, so it means sometimes I won't know what the chit means. that sucks, but whatever. Even if they were in English, I would constantly have to be making lookups into the rules, and one of the player aids, which is not translated, is a list of all the events, which would help if everybody had a sheet of these. I mean, you can imagine playing Opposed where the events book is just one book and everybody's kind of like, yeah, okay, we got our events. Now we're going to spend 15, 20 minutes, each of us looking up our event. So you absolutely want everybody to have a copy of this. And of course, there's only one copy included in the game. And it is not translated. Nobody's done it online, which is a real pity. Well, there is a translation, and you can get it out of the rulebook. Sadly, it's not in the end of the rulebook, nor is it on its own little pages. Now, you can, of course, photocopy it out. It's also fairly large type, so if you wanted to do many copies of it, you'd have to use up lots and lots of pages or scale it down or something. It starts on a fresh page over here, but then the final page of the set is where the appendices start. And it would have been nice if there was a line break in there in the rules translation, just so you can take a packet of those out and, make 2 or 3 copies of it so that you cut that time from 15 minutes to maybe 5 minutes for everybody to look them up. There's also the issue of some of them take effect only in peace turns, some only in war turns. And you have to kind of be aware of that too. There's this very weird feeling of the world changes depending on whether everything's at peace or at war. And to some extent, I really like the idea of, okay, we're at a focal point in history, we're going to slow down and we're going to play this not just year by year, but half year by half year, because we have to worry about the military segments. Less detailed military than the EU, less detailed in a lot of ways than it. But I at least get 2 movement phases each year to go in there. And then we kind of blow up and say, we're in a big period of peace, nothing's happening. But when you're talking about things like rebuilding the army, mercantile growth? Why is that so advantaged during wartime? What's up with that? I'm not sure. Merchant taxation? I don't know again. Not if the country's not in the war, right? Because in some cases, countries which are not involved in the war are the ones reaping the benefits from this wartime economy going on. And in some cases, it's the fact that countries under war are able to stay up because they're winning longer. And they're able to stay down, which doesn't bother me one bit, because they're not doing well more easily. Different nature of how and when leaders die. A lot of stuff like that, which is kind of, well, I got to learn 2 different ways to do the rules, and it kind of feels a little funny. My leader can live longer if there's a war going on, but hey, he retired from public life or whatever. Okay, I can accept that kind of explanation. So when I look at it all, I look at this kind of massive kind of cool ideas that when I heard about them, I wanted the game, I wanted the game before I heard about them. When I did hear about them, when I did read about how it did that periscoping on the time period, I said, wow, I had that idea once, and that really makes sense. But how do they handle it mechanically? And I feel like it just doesn't quite manage it. Like I said, though, I think there's a fairly good game here. I think that if somebody put a lot of work to really getting the game and understanding it and putting out the play aids that would be necessary, this would be a fun multiplayer game. I don't think I could ever get the pleasure out of it solitaire. Maybe not multiplayer either with these chits. You got to replace these fuckers because events, man. I don't like Sword in the Stars for the same damn reason. I've got to constantly look up what the events are. I don't want that. Give me goddamn cards. And so that would be one big event thing that would fix a lot of this for me. You give me a bunch of stupid event chits, and you're already raising my grump level greatly. It's almost amazing that I don't mind La Grande Guerre and Russia. Hispania's a hard sell because simply of those event chits. And they definitely raise my ire in those games too. I think it would be well worth it if you really wanted a good game out of this, to just, pimp it out, build yourself some cards for it, make some nice player aids to keep track of key information, maybe grease board or something like that. Most of the information is fit on a little corner of a sheet of paper. I don't know if I still have it kicking around. Probably it's in here. And a little erasable board with a grease pencil or a marker, and you could keep track of all of that really nicely on a card-sized little piece of information. Event cards for the chits, definitely. Really hammer out what these rules mean. And here's another thing. I totally made a mistake in playing it by trying to work an EU-style event system into it by playing the EU-style scenario system into it, by taking the individual scenarios and focusing their victory points. And I've said this a number of times through the playthrough. I would never do that again. It was too difficult. It doesn't really make sense. A lot in the game doesn't, but this is my own fault directly. The difficulty with it, though, is that is a balancing factor that helps mitigate the amount of points, the point advantage that the mercantile powers have. Because people who wanted to get things done in particular eras got particular bonuses. I think you're supposed to play, though, the Grand Campaign with the Spanish Succession Wars victory point bonuses anyway, at the end of the Grand Campaign. And that's in addition to the victory point bonuses that came out here. Here's another one for you. Glory games. Now, I love EU. I've tired of it a little bit. There's no question. But, it is one of my favorite games of all time and throughout my time period. I've enjoyed Empires in Arms. I think there are others that have this. There are games that I'm not impressed with, like History of the World. But when you relate victory to something that is accumulated over the course of the game, in a two-player game like Victory in the Pacific, it may work well to actually drive historical play. But in something like this, where there's multiple players all competing with each other, the collection of glory over turns interferes with the balance of power dynamics that you actually want running the decisions in the game. You don't want, oh hey, Turkey had a good period 20 years ago, we need to hit them. What you want is, I want the territory Turkey song, where Turkey is a threat right now, and I need to take them out. And if you compare how these glory-based systems work, say against Here I Stand, where you have a fixed victory, or the coin series, or Sword of Rome, where you have a fixed victory condition that you're aiming for. And if you can reach that, you can just declare, I win. Now, these glory systems tend to cover, hey, I want to cover, 60 turns. And I want the game to go 60 turns. I don't want it to be broken because somebody hits an automatic victory condition. And I can understand that desire. But when you're keeping this running tally of victory points, what you end up doing is introducing something, an ahistorical modifier into the game. Now, that's great if it may not be that terrible if everything's done very carefully and everybody plays in a very careful manner and they don't allow it to break apart. So, for example, hey, Holland's kind of running away with this. Let's stomp them. You stomp them. Now they're down at everybody else's level. But it didn't work that way. You stomped Holland, and they're still producing more points than anyone else most turns. They didn't end up winning. That's my fault for not, paying attention to the victory conditions, somewhat deliberately. I knew that they wouldn't sink in completely. I didn't want to play it. I didn't want to be counting victory points as per end of game every turn or whatever. But I definitely I was playing the game without a good feel for just how much territory mattered at the end of the game. It didn't look like it was that big. But you get 4% plus the value of a province. Basically, 5% bonus in victory points for every province that you take. Yeah, you want to take stuff. And you know what? That's going to blow away some of that glory point advantage right there. So, this may have come up with a significant modifier to the glory point advantage that actually gets rid of my main complaint, or at least reduces my main complaint to that. My main complaint to that is it drives ridiculous behavior. In EU, Spain could get lots and lots of points for discovering things, and then at the end of the game, Spain is faltering, but everybody wants to hammer Spain. They want to strip every last thing from her because she's still in the lead. And I felt like that kind of dynamic was driving my play in this, but to tell you the truth, I didn't have a really good grip on who was actually winning. So that's another thing. It takes, at least a bit more effort than I put into understanding the victory in this game. And probably, in my case, it takes at least a play to have really gotten a grasp of that. I would say for a lot of people that would probably be the case, because there are a few people who will just zone out on the victory conditions and figure that out and have that calculated for them. I don't usually do that on my first playing, and I haven't seen too many people do that. A small handful of very competitive players who like to look at a new game and then just really, really try to absorb those victory conditions and do what the game is trying to drive them to do. And in this case, I can't really speak to that because I didn't know Spain was running away with the game. I thought this was between other powers. I knew they were getting a good percentage, but it looked like other people were too. And I didn't internalize the information skills. Anyway, I'll probably end up playing it again some point. It's not a total loss. I almost wish that I could, really devote the effort to trying to make this into something that I really, really want. Add those extra components. Nail down the rules and really say, okay, this is how this should go. Think about it really hard, But that's not going to happen. I too much flutter from game to game these days. Anyway, that's Grand Siecle.